This report concerns the core political and administrative decision-making in response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
I think it's total nonsense. It's disastrous, actually, for any credibility that the inquiry was clinging onto. The models were just way, way, way off. I mean, if you can imagine, they had a sort of COVID curve of deaths, and then the actual deaths were almost flat along the bottom. They were so inaccurate. The inquiry could at least say, look, lockdown is clearly an extreme and damaging intervention. Was it really necessary? But they don't seem to want to do that.
Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spikes. I'm delighted to be joined by Michael Simmons, Economics Editor at The Spectator and host of the new podcast, Reality Check. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks for having me, Fraser.
I really wanted to have you on to talk about the COVID inquiry, because you've done some brilliant skewering of some of the statistics they've been putting out. Now, the COVID inquiry, to remind people, chaired by Baroness Hallett, it's now in its third year, some 5 years after the inquiry. It's got a projected cost of over £200 million. And one of the modules has come to the rather startling conclusion that had we just locked down a week earlier, then we might have saved 23,000 lives. Michael, you take issue with that figure, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, I think it's total nonsense. And the way it's been included is disastrous, actually, for any credibility that the inquiry was clinging onto. Let's start with the figure itself. When it's first mentioned in the sort of introduction bit of this particular report from the inquiry, Hallett uses the phrase "modelling has established" and then goes on to bring up the 23,000 figure. There's loads of issues there to unpack. The first one is that phrase "modelling has established." That's not what modelling does, right? Modelling just doesn't establish things. And in the best case, we know with reasonable assumptions, modelling gives you, something about some hypothetical. But of course, in real life, there are an infinite number of variables to any event. And modelling, just cannot approximate that. So this model, which by the way is quite hard to get into the report what she's referring to, because the first time it's mentioned, it's not actually sourced. But eventually we see she's referring to Neil Ferguson's famous model, which we at the Spectator,
Infamous, in fact.
Yeah, infamous, yeah. Had picked apart. And essentially the issue with that number, in my view, is that Neil Ferguson had used quite sort of far out assumptions. And this mathematics professor, Simon Wood, took the same model and used kind of more, I'm reluctant to use the word realistic, but more middle of the road assumptions, and actually finds little difference. There's other modelling that Baroness Hallett looked at that finds that COVID had actually, or wave one of COVID had actually peaked before that lockdown. We know from Google mobility data that, people had basically locked themselves down anyway. So on the face of it, including that number, it is a big, bizarre, inclusion anyway. And again, that language of modelling has established, it made me chuckle because back on my old job, when I was data editor at The Spectator, when Fraser Nelson and I were doing a lot of work on showing, these models later on in the pandemic, how these models were doing versus actual, which was particularly out there when it came to Omicron, where the models were just way, way, way off. I mean, if you can imagine, they had a sort of COVID curve of deaths, and then the actual deaths were almost flat along the bottom. They were so inaccurate. Every time we reported that, we would write in the copy, or we'd say in a podcast something like, well, Sage model predicts or Sage model forecasts, which is not that different to the phrase modelling has established. And every time we did that, a press officer for a scientist or a scientist themselves would be on the phone saying, you're misrepresenting what modelling is. And it's quite funny that now seems to have flipped on its head. I then think even just sort of politically, how Hallett has included this so early in the report, it seems such a daft thing to do, because obviously, look, I and many others have leaped on it to discredit the report. But if you read the rest of the report, there's lots of sensible stuff in there about, how devolution could work better. There's there's interesting findings and recommendations. And actually, towards the end, she sort of buries the point that if you look at the pandemic across the whole, that there's not much evidence actually that total deaths would have been improved by any of this. But the way she's included it, the way she's phrased it, means that, of course, the media, I include myself in this, have picked this up because you can draw out the headline that Boris Johnson is somehow responsible for 23,000 additional deaths, which is just ridiculous and I think discredits really the whole inquiry.
And it's interesting that, that she's using any modeling at all, because as you mentioned earlier, we actually have real world examples of what it would look like without a lockdown. You mentioned the Omicron wave of, December 2021, January 2022. This, of course, is after the vaccination. So that is obviously a major factor that reduced the number of deaths. But as you said, Sage were modelling, I think, they were predicting something, a bloodbath of 6,000 deaths a day if there wasn't a lockdown. Their best case scenario, I think, was 600 deaths a day. It didn't even come close to that. Surely that at that point, the modelling had been discredited. And we also, again, we could have looked at the real world rather than this kind of alternate reality as generated in a computer simulation.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you're completely right. This is what the inquiry seems intent on dismissing and ignoring. And it seems to have baked in the same mistakes that I think number 10 made throughout the pandemic. Was that it just, after this initial debate about flatten the curve and all that, they switched into, it just became orthodoxy that lockdowns work. And then it was just a debate about when you do the lockdowns, how long they're for, etc., etc., etc. And the inquiry seems to have, rather than, questioning that assumption, rather than looking at, say, Sweden, who ended up with, as you've reported many times, and we've reported as well, had way less excess deaths at the end of the 3 years than we did without having a government mandated lockdown. And the inquiry could be looking at why our modelling missed that. And it wouldn't be hard for them to find this out. It's all on the record. There's been parliamentary select committees. There was an event at the Royal Statistical Society where it was explained that essentially the issue with our models is they did not assume, or meant most of them did not assume, a behavioural response. It did not assume that the public would look at the daily reported death figures. They would see the clips on the news at 10 of, people in hospital wards and moderate their own behaviour, which is what happened in Sweden and is what happened here. So the inquiry should be, in my view, should be saying lockdowns clearly have a massive cost to education, to children, to the economy, which we won't fully be able to fully kind of diagnose or get the total cost of that damage for decades to come. But the inquiry could at least say, look, lockdown is clearly an extreme and damaging intervention. Was it really necessary? But they don't seem to want to do that. They seem to have, as I say, they've baked in that same mistake and just accepting this modelling orthodoxy. It just seems a worthless way to spend £200 million.
And I definitely want to come on to the cost and damage of lockdown. But do you think this points to just a broader problem of groupthink, establishment groupthink? And I don't just mean in terms of the assumption that lockdown was good, because that was a pretty new and novel idea that the herd suddenly came around to. That wasn't the scientific view until around March 2020.
Completely right.
The inquiry actually started, bizarrely, with a lot of denunciations about Brexit. I seem to remember Hugo Keith KC, one of his first speeches was saying, the evidence has established that preparations for Brexit have distracted from the work towards the pandemic. He said this before any evidence has been submitted, by the way. I don't want to dwell on Brexit in particular, but it does just seem that the way this inquiry has worked has been to deliver the establishment line, exonerate the people who work within the state, the scientific experts, and damn everyone else, whether that's the politicians like Boris Johnson or perhaps skeptical experts, rather than actually getting to the truth.
Yeah, so I don't necessarily blame Baroness Hallett for this, although I think she's done a terrible job of this particular report. I think the lawyers that tend to be involved with public inquiries are quite political people, and they're entitled to be political people. And they're people who like the sound of their own voices as well, which again, I don't necessarily make a criticism, because you and I like the sound of our own voices too, otherwise we wouldn't do the jobs we do. And I think that comes out through the inquiries, and it would be better if they could moderate that a little more. I think the fundamental issue of why these inquiries don't want to sort of question what you say just seems to have become the established orthodoxy that lockdowns are a good thing and you're bad if you oppose them, is really because of, you have to look back at sort of the history of inquiries in this country. I think the obvious example is if you look at Hillsborough, and how Hillsborough was sort of covered up, how the Hillsborough families were treated. I think there's been a sort of a desire to correct that and bring in victims' voices more into these things. And I think unfortunately, we've seen this in the COVID inquiry, where the COVID families for justice, who are obviously, bereaved and upset people, I think, I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but I think they have almost too much of a voice. And there's a worry, it seems to me, among the inquiry lawyers, and probably Baroness Hallett as well, about doing anything that would be that the families wouldn't like. And you can see this in the way that the inquiry operates. I mean, it has this big listening exercise where it wants to hear from victims. And I think it's actually a perversion of natural justice. The whole reason we obviously have courts is so that the victims of crime or the victims of incidents, aren't the ones meting out the justice. And I think there's such a worry about being seem to do the right thing by the victims, that the inquiry has just not got the balls to say, actually, maybe lockdown was not a good thing.
And it kind of assumes that where there are victims, there are villains as well, when actually, this is more akin to a natural disaster. I mean, we can get on to whether it's from a lab or not, but this is clearly not. The British government is not directly responsible for this pandemic. I do want to come on to the cost of lockdown and to the economic cost in particular, because we are in budget week. We know that Britain spent an enormous amount of money on its COVID response, printed an enormous amount of money to pay for that. We're now currently spending over £100 billion per year servicing our debt. That is obviously a big factor in some of the tough decisions that Rachel Reeves is having to make in her budget. But it seems to be the kind of elephant in the room. COVID is rarely mentioned in our discussions about the economy. Do you think it's still having an effect? Do you think it's still scarring us? And if so, why aren't politicians talking about it?
Oh, it's 100% scarring us. I'll deal with your second question first, which is, I think we just all want to forget about it. I mean, people don't want it. When you have things like the infected blood inquiry, or you've got the child abuse inquiry in Scotland, people pay a lot of attention to it because, thankfully, the vast majority of us were not victims of these events. So we have empathy for the victims, and we want to see justice by them. So those inquiries get a lot of attention. I think with the COVID inquiry, because literally every person in Britain experienced it, most of us know someone who, if they weren't killed in COVID or the lockdowns, were seriously unwell, or their lives were irrevocably changed. And I think because of that, people don't want to, think about it really or talk about it, which is why it doesn't feature as heavily as it should do when we talk about the state our economy's in. In terms of what it actually has done to the economy, there's two obvious things. The first is the labour market. We've seen this massive trend to worklessness, to people be on these out of work benefits, because I think our national psyche changed during lockdown, in that when you were a little bit ill, but you would still send your kids to school, or you still felt that you had to go to work. I think that's changed, and maybe that change initially was a good thing, but it's gone too far now, where people are getting into this position where they're afraid to be in work or to be in school. The more direct economic effect, actually, I think you can blame on the Bank of England. And I actually don't understand why the Chancellor doesn't make this point more, because it would get her a bit off the hook, is if you think about interest rates and monetary policy between 2008 and 2020, money had basically become free or very, very cheap because interest rates were hovering around zero. Our politicians therefore got hooked on this cheap money, which is what financed these spending splurges. Then the whole world locks down, supply chains come under strain, and of course, inflation comes back. And not only were the Bank of England, in my view, almost criminally late to increase interest rates, they also said that inflation was transitory. We didn't need to worry too much. They said it was going to peak at 5%, when it ended up peaking at 11%. And effectively, the Bank of England completely lost control of inflation. It got it down back to target very briefly. And in my view, it's lost control of it again. And that has huge knock-on effects for all of us for the cost of living, but not least, you mentioned the debt interest. Part of the reason the debt interest is so expensive is because about a quarter of our debt, our gilts, are what are so-called linkers, which means they're hedged for inflation. They're linked to inflation, which again, in the era of near 0% interest rates was not an issue. But now that interest rates are 4%, it's a serious issue, and it's what's actually risking bankrupting the country. So I think the decisions of the Bank of England through COVID are being felt now, will be felt for years to come, and I would say are under discussed.
Michael Simmons, thank you very much.